Thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you for those truly inspiring and optimistic comments. And I agree with you entirely that this is a moment to start feeling very optimistic about trends, at least in some African countries. Perhaps there are also trends to be concerned about. Let me perhaps start off the discussion before we open it up with going back to your point of where you started about the purpose of aid, using aid to end aid. And this seems to be a really important message at a time when certainly across the African continent, as you said, there is a new breed of leadership really looking to identify the pathway out of aid dependence. But let me just track back a moment to something you've actually mentioned in your op-ed yesterday about the potential for a skeptical public, certainly in donor countries, about this message around using aid to end aid. For they feel on the whole quite happy with the argument that supporting, delivering aid to support and resolve humanitarian crises is an essential function of aid, but the idea that aid can actually build institutions and strengthen governance over the long term in order to reduce aid dependence is an area where they feel a lot more skeptical. How do you build a sort of strong message for the public here in the UK and elsewhere around this message of using aid to end aid?
Yeah, it's very difficult because the thing is that I mean, what makes the most emotional impact on people undoubtedly is the relief of famine, poverty, and so on. On the other hand, I think you can, I mean, that's what the example that I gave from Sierra Leone can show, but I think you can also do it, by the way, in terms of even private sector investment. You know, you can show also, I think, and this is the only way to do it, to demonstrate by example. And the reason we started AGI was to try and prove a concept, right? That actually, if you do invest in building capacity and you do it in the right way, then it can have an enormous impact. Now, I think capacity building itself needs to undergo a kind of revolution in the way we do it. But, you know, just to give you an example from Sierra Leone and Liberia, but I would apply this to a lot of the countries on that west coast of Africa. You know, they have fantastic potential deep sea port facilities, right? They need those ports to function properly. They haven't been functioning properly. You know, as a result of that, it's far harder to do trade and to do business in those countries. So actually helping them put the port under proper management, you know, get it invested in, get proper practices on the quayside and so on. You're going to attract business in, you're going to get the right type of investment, you're going to have to start a whole series of small businesses around that. You know, I think, for example, how we handle this whole China part of this, you know, we could do so with a lot of imagination, actually, if we really wanted to. Although there are obviously lots of issues about it, I think, actually, frankly, there are some lessons for us as well as lessons for them. You know, so my point is that in the end, you know, some of those changes, that changes a country. Now, by the way, the reason why I think this can also be done today is what you cannot do is capacity build in a country where the leadership isn't interested. Right? That is for sure, right? So we don't work in countries where the leadership is not saying, right, I buy into this notion. But, you know, let me give you another example of a completely different part of the work that I do. I mean, effectively, in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with Prime Minister Fayyad in Palestine to build the Palestinian Authority capacity. Because he has bought into this in the first, he's really, I think, the most significant Palestinian leader to have bought into this concept, you know, under the leadership of President Abbas, of course, but he has sort of bought into this in a big way and really built those institutions in Palestine. For the first time, right, you could see in the last few years people thinking, well, we've got something to protect here. There are institutions that function. So quite apart from the fact the economy then grows and so on and so forth. But the point that I'm making is, you know, this capacity building is really, it can only be done with proper leadership in the sort of host country, as it were. But it is, you know, when you think about the things you could do with it, it's so obvious that it's the change maker.
Let me just bring you up on this point about leadership versus sort of leaders. I mean, quite a lot of the work you've been doing with AGI and elsewhere has focused on supporting leaders, political leaders, and those on which you have over time built something of a personal relationship. How does that relate then to a sort of broader agenda about building cultures of leadership through government, which essentially ride out the political business cycle in a way, help build policy continuity, help build a sense of accountability over time?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and I'm biased in this, so right, take that. That's my starting point. But I found in government, without a strong centre, nothing ever gets done. Basically, I'm afraid. Now, I know there's lots of people who say, no, you're disempowering all the outlying parts of government. But whether what the centre's doing is right or wrong, by the way, that's another matter. But I found you needed that, strength of leadership in the centre. And I also think that the best way of building that leadership, surviving the electoral cycle and so on, is to show that leadership can work. You see, I think the single most important thing for any of the African countries to root their democracy is to show that when you elect a government, something happens and gets done. And, how many of these elections still happen within a framework where people are trading off all sorts of alliances? They might be tribal, they might be sectarian of one sort or another, but that's just the way it is, because that's the way the politics has been for so long. I always say this to people, what you've got to do is to get to the point where people say, no, I don't really care if I'm from this part of the country or that tribe or this ethnicity or this faith, but actually the person who delivers me the best services or is going to deliver economic growth for me, I'm going to back them. Right. That requires quite a shift in culture, and I think it only really happens when people see it, someone doing it. So that's my biased and prejudiced view of leadership.